आप कब देंगे? क्यों?
So while India has gradually moved beyond the horrors of the destructive second wave of the COVID-19 pandemic and is coping reasonably well with the present crisis of Omicron. So can you get the house in order, sir, so we can have a meaningful debate? Sir.
प्लीज हाँ मैं शुरू कर रहा हूँ शशि जी शशि थरूर माननीय सदस्य एक मिनट बेटी एक मिनट शशि खान थरूर जी प्लीज सुरेश जी प्लीज बैठिए
Thank you, Speaker, sir. I hope we'll start the clock again from now for our time. We're very obsessed with the amount of time we get, sir. Thank you for giving me this opportunity once again. I was saying that while India has moved out beyond the horrors of the destructive second wave of the COVID pandemic and is coping reasonably well with the current Omicron wave, there can be no doubt that the past year has placed the citizens of our country in unimaginable distress. The pain that so many of our fellow citizens have suffered, especially during the tragic and widespread loss of life between March and May last year, has etched scars in our public consciousness that can never be erased, sir. Today, we've crossed the unsettling landmark of officially recording over 5 lakh COVID-related deaths, and perhaps almost 6 to 7 times that figure unofficially. It's a grim reminder of the far-reaching implications of the pandemic. In that context, sir, the presentation of the budget annually cannot merely be seen as a purely routine economic exercise or as an endeavor in straightforward accounting involving fiduciary allocations and unassuming numbers. Rather, it is an instrument through which the government of the day presents a political vision to manage the economy, heal the country, and to set it on a path to recovery. The budget serves as a platform through which the people of this nation are informed, sir, of the political priorities of their government, a government which was sworn in on the constitutional premise and promise that it will safeguard the interests of all Indians. So what then were the expectations the people of this country had of this government's priorities and vision? And what could we have expected the government to offer the people through the budget? I would say there were 3 broad expectations that the nation had. I would say there were 3 broad expectations that the nation had.
Sir, ask her to come here. This is the main house. No, she has to come here. She has to come here. She can come here.
I think we can see her on the screen.
No, she has to be here.
Honorable member, she is sitting and the other house and listening to proceedings. She is listening. No, wait a minute.
Was an expectation that this government would acknowledge the problems the nation is facing, acknowledge the fact that our nation is today facing unprecedented levels of unemployment, which has left countless citizens, especially our young and dynamic working age population, with little prospects for a brighter tomorrow. Admit that 1/5 of India's population has plunged a staggering 53% in the last 5 years in their income, while the wealth of the richest 100 Indians has soared to 57 lakh crore rupees. 4.7 crore Indians have slipped into extreme poverty below the poverty line. Acknowledge the fact that the Indian middle class has been left defenseless in the face of rising inflation, shrinking incomes, and the consequent acceleration of household debt. Recognize the widespread distress and anguish in the agrarian economy, exacerbated by the peremptory manner in which your government passed the 3 contentious farm laws that drove hundreds of our farmers to camp outside the borders of our city in the bitter winter cold, the harsh summer sun, and the soaking monsoon rain, in a cause for which over 670 of them gave their lives. And concede that all these issues have been avoidable misadventures forged by your style of misgovernance. A style of governance that prioritizes one-man rule over consultation, a style that demands conformity rather than seeking consensus, and a style that has scant regard for the fundamental conventions or institutions that have traditionally guided our democracy. We all heard the Prime Minister today telling us of his government's achievements, of what But let's ask, sir, what are toilets? What use are toilets without running water? Gas cylinders whose refills you can't afford? Electricity connections whose bills you can't pay because you don't have a job? प्रधानमंत्री का शेर भी हम सुना सर उनका जवाब है अली सादर जाफरी के शब्दों में तुमने फिरदौस के बदल में जहन्नुम देकर कह दिया हमसे गुलिस्तान में बहार आ गई है बागबान बन के उठे और चमन बेच दिया है That is what this government has done, sir. So we've been left bitterly disappointed by this government's unwillingness to offer even a token recognition of the problems they've caused, of the widespread anguish they have inflicted upon the Aam Aadmi, the unemployed youth, our Kisans, who are still facing the existential crisis caused by this government. This House has not forgotten the Prime Minister talking about zero budget natural farming because his government has, I'm sorry to say, left a zero in the budget for farmers. Second expectation, sir, that the people of this nation had was for the government to usher in concrete actions and corrective measures to address the multi-pronged calamities that their own government has caused them. An expectation to address the increasing unemployment crisis and declining labor force participation by developing targeted measures for job creation and strengthening existing employment guarantee schemes like Manrega. An expectation to provide urgent life support for the MSME sector, battered first by demonetization and then by lockdowns. Help them through fiscal support and a less exacting regulatory framework. An expectation from the government to mitigate the crisis of the middle class by reducing income tax or at least raising the exemption slab to at least 5 lakhs, as this government had repeatedly promised earlier. Arresting the untrammeled rise in the prices of basic commodities. An expectation that the government would have the commitment and the vision to design a pathway out of the staggering inequality in our country. And where our Kisans are concerned, an expectation to fix the cracks in our MSP and offer them support in terms of the procurement of basic commodities like fertilizers at a time when the price of raw material is skyrocketing. Sadly, this government's budget has given the nation exactly the opposite. A significant slashing of the Manrega scheme, more tokenism in credit support for the MSME sector, no changes in the personal taxation regime, and no relief in terms of addressing rising inflation, no targeted efforts for job creations, barring the inadequate 60 lakh jobs over 5 years, a far cry from the 2 crore jobs a year they had promised earlier in the equally illusory Achhe Din. The reduction of budgets for social welfare schemes and significant cuts in schemes for crop insurance, MSP and fertilizers, leading many farmer groups to term this budget as a revenge budget. In the words of Kamna Prasad, कल की खातिर आज को बर्बाद करके रख दिया हम तुम्हारी दूरंदेशी के कायल हो गए जो थे पस्ती में उन्हें बस ख्वाब दिखाए गए जो बुलंदी पर थे उनको और ऊंचा कर दिया That's what's happened here, sir. Now, while none of these concerns would address the people of this country, at least expected from the government to learn from the grim experiences of recent times and prioritize allocations accordingly, then the budget might offer a vision of economic recovery that would guide our nation out of the darkness and distress of the pandemic and the aftermath. But where have we seen this, sir? This government has not learned from the repeated instances of incursions on our sovereign territory by expanding the defense budget and providing support for our armed forces to accelerate urgent modernization requirements. The government has not learned from our harrowing ordeals during the height of the pandemic to strengthen our medical infrastructure so as to shore up our preparedness in the event of future contagion. The government has not learned to increase allocations to education so as to prepare our young children better to cope with an uncertain future. The government has not learned to attend to the problems of today's Indian citizens rather than stretching the mirage of Achhe Din 25 years into the future into some illusory Amrit Kal that no one in the government will be around to be accountable for at all. After all, अगली नस्लों को तबाही से बचाने के लिए जो भी करना है इसी नस्ल को करना होगा. But they're not interested in doing any of that. They would rather just defer and postpone. We have hollow slogans and insincere promises, the famous jumlas and the empty claims of achievements. To paraphrase Ghalib, हमको मालूम है बजट की हकीकत, लेकिन दिल को बहलाने के लिए निर्मला जी ये ख्याल अच्छा है. Anyway, I'm sorry to say, Mr. Chairman, that the announcements of this budget simply mask a betrayal by the government of the hopes and aspirations of the people. Tamanna asman ki thi, zameen bhi na mili. However, it was good to hear the Honorable Finance Minister quoting from the Mahabharata's Shanti Parva, talking about the duty of a king to govern the state in accordance with dharma. Of course, this government would do well to remember the equally prescient wisdom also in the same Shanti Parva, which warns that when a kingdom goes into decline, the life of that king is one of shame. As a more recent poet, Dushyant Kumar famously said, जिस दौर में मखलूक को मैसर नहीं रोटी, उस दौर के सुल्तान से कोई भूल हुई है. So what then is the state of this kingdom and the sultan? Any conversation on the state of this country must necessarily commence with the state of the people who make up the nation, sir. After all, there's no robust economy or GDP growth as abstract or theoretical concepts unless you're concerned about the welfare of the people who constitute this economy. That understanding of our economy is simply not there in our finance minister's budget. Partly as a result of the pandemic and partly on account of consistent failures in policy making since 2014, the Aam Aadmi finds himself in an unprecedented state of distress. The Honorable Finance Minister in her address spoke about how her government constantly strives to provide the necessary ecosystem for the middle classes. I heard the Prime Minister also using this word. It's become the new favorite word of the government, the ecosystem. After seeing the contents of the budget, sir, the Indian middle class would like to know what is in this ecosystem. Was it the disruptive policy of demonetization that denied our citizens access to their own money overnight and caused widespread economic havoc and the unconscionable loss of lives? Was that part of the ecosystem for the middle class? Was this government's decision to repeatedly increase excise duties on fuel and their lethargy in tackling the drastic increase in the prices of basic commodities from LPG cylinders to pulses to edible oil part of the so-called ecosystem for the middle class? LPG has gone up in 1 year in Delhi from 502 rupees to 899, sir. Is that the ecosystem they'd like to talk about? Or was it the proposal in this budget to reduce corporate surcharge from 12% to 7% while offering no change in either personal income tax rates or the slabs which are exempt from taxation at a time of severe economic distress? Is that also part of their grand ecosystem for the middle class after promising that they would do so in Mr. Jaitley's first budget of 2014? One thing that was made abundantly clear, even if the ecosystem is not clear, is that for the middle class and the poor, who are both mentioned a grand total of 2 times in the speech, thereby betraying the real priorities of this government, this budget has served as a definitive and unconscionable letdown. Let's take the unemployment rates, Mr. Chairman. Just last week, the Center for the Monitoring of the Indian Economy published fresh data which pegged the unemployment rate as of January at 6.57%. This is certainly a welcome improvement from 7.9% in the previous month. It still remains higher than the unemployment rates in our country, the worst unemployment rate in our country in the last 45 years. In December, the nation had 5.3 crore individuals, 53 million, who were unemployed, including 3.5 crore who were actively seeking work and could not find any. It's a strong indictment of this government's ineptitude that India's unemployment rate in recent months has grown faster than Bangladesh and Vietnam, sir. It is also no wonder then that we are witnessing an unprecedented and worrying decline in incomes and a simultaneous increase in household debt. You know, sir, in the last 2 years, 84% of households have suffered a loss of income. Per capita income has fallen from 1,08,000 in 2019-20 to 1,07,000 in 21-22. This has naturally depressed household spending and, of course, saving. During the UPA era, mass welfare schemes ensured that we were able to pull 270 million Indians, 27.3 crore Indians were pulled out of poverty by the UPA government. Under this government's watch, 4.7 crore Indians, 47 million, have been pushed back under the poverty line. So for the first time since 1995, the annual income of the poorest 20% of India's households fell by 53%, as I mentioned earlier. And in the same 5-year period, that is the last 5 years, the richest 20% saw their annual household income grow 39%. So the poorest 20% down by 53%, the richest 20% up by 39%. This is what my senior colleague Rahul Gandhi was talking about when he spoke of two Indias. The rapid expansion in income inequality in our country is not just a great source of concern, but as Rahul Gandhi had pointed out, an issue that really stands to threaten the social fabric that has held our country together since independence. We've already seen one such instance from the recent railway recruitment drive, where 1.25 crore applicants applied for just 35,000 listed jobs. This grave unemployment crisis that under this government's watch threatens to convert our demographic dividend into a demographic disaster required urgency and a sense of purpose from this government, which is missing in all this talk of Amrit Kal. In fact, the poet Dushyant Kumar put it quite well. Bhukh hai to sabr kar, roti nahi to kya hua? Aajkal Delhi mein hai zere bahas ye mudda. That's all that's going on is bahas. There is no action coming out of this government. In fact, sir, this reminds me, since we had the Prime Minister quoting from a distinguished former Prime Minister, let me quote a senior member of this House who used to be a Chief Minister. He said, Kahan jayega mera navjawan? Kahan jayega ye garib maa ka beta? Kahan jayega? Kis desh mein rahega? Kis desh mein rahega is a very good question to ask the author of these words, who is none other than our Honorable Prime Minister himself, sir. We should ask him, according to his government, the answer for our jobless youth who are facing not just poverty, but an affront to their dignity and their ability to provide for their families today, that they have to wait another 25 years for their Amrit Kal. By their own logic, the government appears to have adopted a twist to Sant Kabir Das's famous doha, which in today's India means, Aaj kare so kal kare so parson. Itni bhi kya jaldi hai, jab achhe din aane barson. It is a matter, sir, of national disgrace that this government has, during a period of record levels of unemployment and distress in the rural economy, chosen to slash the funds for Manrega by nearly 25% or 1/4. Last year, in response to the unprecedented clamor for jobs, you were forced to bring in additional funding for the Manrega scheme through supplementary demands for grants in December, and that took the total allocation to 98,000 crores. Rather than learn from this experience, which we had warned the government about in my own budget speech a year ago, I had warned the finance minister this would happen. It happened, and they've still not learned the lesson. This year, they've again budgeted too little, just 73,000 crores for Manrega this year. It's an allocation that defies logic, that blatantly ignores the on-ground reality in the country. The Prime Minister kept telling us, let us see the on-ground reality, the grassroots reality. That's what the Finance Minister needs to do herself, because already out of the 73,000 crores, 20,000 crores are pending in dues from last year that they have not paid. So in effect, she has provided an artificial paltry 50,000 crores for this entire scheme, which is such a vital scheme to keep the rural population afloat. Most experts have consistently added that have argued that Manrega needs a minimum of 1.34 crores, 1.34 lakh crores, or up to a maximum, depending on which expert you consult, of 3.5 lakh crores in order to meet the increasing demand for jobs, if you want to keep your promise of a minimum guarantee of 100 days of employment. As of last year, sir, an estimated 91 lakh households that demanded employment under the scheme were ignored. Forget developing an urban version of Manrega to address rising urban poverty, as many experts have advocated. The current allocations will mean that the government will at best be able to provide 16 to 20 days of work, sir, not 100. It's even worse than their miserable performance last year, which saw that on average households only receive 52 days of work as opposed to 100. So this is supposed to be the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme, but neither the word employment nor the word guarantee is apparently of any value to this government's ecosystem. They have not taken them seriously. They're providing no guarantees and no employment. Now, the government may not have much regard for this scheme. The Honorable Prime Minister once described it as a living monument to the failure of the UPA government. But let me remind my colleagues this evening that it was that very monument of the UPA government that served as a ventilator for the rural economy during the pandemic. A monument of the UPA which provided 13.3 crore Indians with jobs during the height of the pandemic, after this government abdicated its responsibility of shielding our citizens from the economic distress that engulfed rural India. The Prime Minister was criticizing the Congress Party for helping people to go to their homes. But what arrangements did this government make to feed and shelter and look after these migrant workers here, in there, wherever they were? There was absolutely no arrangement made, and that's why they had to go home, sir. And the government remains shamefully culpable for what they have done. The truth is, with all of this distress that they did nothing about, this indeed, Manrega, is a monument of the UPA. And indeed, the government was forced to increase the budgetary allocations to 1.1 lakh crores during the pandemic because it was the only lifeline for our rural people. And if that today is still seen by the government as a monumental failure, then we are proud to wear this as a badge of honor, sir. The monument was built by us. The failure is theirs. But this budget has missed a far more vital issue. How will we, in a country where the median age stands at a youthful 28, provide jobs for the millions of our underemployed and unemployed youth? This budget talks about the creation of 60 lakh jobs over 5 years. But I'm sorry to say, respected Chairman, 12 lakh jobs a year, which is what it comes down to, is no kind of solution in a country where 5.3 crore are currently unemployed and 47.5 lakh job seekers enter the Labor Department's own figures of the job market each year. The government, a government that tells the nation where 47.5 lakh people are added to the unemployment list every year, is grandly promising in the budget 12 lakh jobs. This is what we're seeing, sir. I must say that I'm reminded again of the words of the immortal Dushant Kumar. Kahan to tay tha ujala har ghar ke liye, kahan chirag mayassar nahi sheher ke liye. Not even a simple lamp for anybody. That's what this government has reduced us to. Now, one concrete measure to boost employment generation would have been to support our ailing MSMEs, which till the commencement of the pandemic actually managed to employ 42% of the people in this country who had any work. And that's despite the savage blow undertaken because of demonetization. This budget has done very, very little to recognize and support this extraordinary need. While we welcome the announcement of the extension of the ECGLS scheme till March 2023, merely providing credit support is never enough. So it falls short of the recommendation by the Parliamentary Standing Committee on Industry, which urged the government to offer a larger economic package with long-term measures. 60 lakh MSMEs went out of business after demonetization. And SIDBI, the Prime Minister seemed to refer to it, they pronounce it slightly differently. SIDBI says that 67% of the remaining MSMEs that they surveyed closed last year. So you may disagree with our and SIDBI's assessment of the MSMEs that your policies are forced to close, but that's a bit rich given your own admission that the government does not maintain any data on this. So I don't know how they can disagree with us. But the scale of the challenge has yet been reaffirmed by the SIDBI report, the most recent one, which highlighted not just the closures, but that more than 50% of MSMEs witnessed a decline of more than 25% in their revenues. So what was the PM talking about when he praised himself, patted himself on the back about MSMEs? I don't know. Now, rather than offering concrete support, sir, this government had failed to provide basic interventions such as the restoration of the interest subvention scheme or a reduction in GST rates, the good and simple tax, which is neither good nor simple. That's the story we have in the country. It's leaving manufacturers of auto parts with a 28% slab. The garment industry, GST has been hiked from 5% to 12%. How are you going to get the economy to flourish without any concessions in these? And the MSMEs in these sectors are just suffering terribly. And already the rising costs of commodities like fuel, particularly with this government's taxes on fuel, on petrol and diesel, has made them even more unviable. Now, the treatment of MSMEs mirrors the manner in which the agrarian economy, which is the other mainstay of employment in our country, has been shortchanged in this budget. Forget the promise of doubling farmer incomes by 22-23. Do you remember that promise, sir, from the Prime Minister? They've wisely not repeated that promise this year. There was no mention of farm incomes in the budget at all. No mention. Not only has this sector's share in the overall allocations declined from last year, but their announcements have left farmer unions alleging an attitude of revenge from this government for having been forced to retract the poorly conceived farm bills. So I'm entitled to a few more minutes, sir. I lost a bit at the beginning because of people's disturbance. So I just want to say, sir, that the government has only marginally increased the total allocation for agriculture by a miserly 4.4%, while slashing funding for key schemes like the Pradhan Mantri Fasal Bima Yojana down by 3.1%, significant reductions in key subsidies, including for fertilizers, down 25%, and of course for petroleum, which is down by 11%. So they can talk about increased procurement under MSP, but this is only restricted to wheat and paddy. And as farmer unions have pointed out, the number of beneficiaries of the MSP regime has fallen by 17%, and the quantity procured has fallen by 7% in the last year. With all the other cuts, we are seeing a real crisis in the farm sector. And you know, it's ironic when the Prime Minister keeps reminding us of how much the strength of India lies in the villages and the need to bridge the gulf between urban and rural India, whereas his budget, his government's budget, is widening the chasm between these two Indias. There's much more that I could say, sir. I do want to mention a couple of things. Certainly, the budget's neglect is also going to further accelerate the hardships faced by other vulnerable sectors in our country, like fisher folk. In my constituency, Thiruvananthapuram, sir, they're struggling with severe shortages of kerosene. They've largely slipped below the poverty line in the last couple of years. The government is indifferent. There is no special measures for them. So there are a couple of things, sir. Defense, the government, again, the Prime Minister talked about defense exports. But what is he giving to the soldiers who are already here, sir? The overall budget for defense has increased 4.3%, but it's actually a nominal decrease once inflation has been factored in. We're happy they may have increased the capital allocation, but it falls short of the Defense Ministry's own projections, which says that they would need 8.45 lakh crores to meet their modernization plans by 26-27, and that would require a 16% year-on-year increase. So the fact is that the Prime Minister's optimism is not warranted. 3 minutes. I do want to stress that there is a real problem with the defense budgets not being increased, but equally, let's look at health. We've been facing a pandemic for the last 2 years. The healthcare budget has been grossly underfunded again. Despite the frailties in our medical infrastructure that were exposed by the pandemic, the health sector was only given 200 crores more this year. Once you factor in inflation, that is also an overall decrease. And it's a long way off from the goal envisaged in the National Health Policy 2017 of spending 2.5% of our GDP on health. Ill health drives our citizens into poverty, but the government is not raising money for the National Health Mission, sir. Just 2 minutes more, so that not all budgets, not all announcements in the budget.
Two more speakers are there in your party, please.
Pardon me, sir?
2 more speakers are there.
I know, but I will abbreviate. I do want to stress a couple of things in particular. There was a lot of celebration on the budget about the announcement of increase in capital expenditure, but we are concerned about whether it will generate urgently need jobs because of the government's poor implementation record. CapEx has actually fallen in each of the last 3 quarters, along with a decline in new project announcements in the last quarter. And at the same time, we've heard about the Vande Bharat trains. We're very glad we in Kerala look forward to receiving them to enhance the speed of travel in our state. But there have been many, many specific requests for allocations missing, including, in my own experience as an MP, I can say, a long-promised new terminal at Nemam, doubling of the Thiruvananthapuram to Kanyakumari line. Nothing has been done since introduction of new memo trains. I'm sure every MP has similar concerns. We have not seen any announcement of a new aims for Kerala, which has been promised for many, many years. And of course, education, I've already talked about, has been completely neglected in this budget. Now, I do want to stress, sir, that as far as we are concerned, we've been startled by the lack of consistency in the government's approach, even on privatization. They make announcements and they don't implement them, sir. Last year, they announced a national
Please conclude.
monetization pipeline to see 6 lakh crore worth of old infrastructure to finance new infrastructure building. Again, this year, they're silent on it. Whatever they announced the imminent privatization of 2 banks and an insurance company. What happened, sir? Nothing. This year, they didn't even mention it. So if you look at the budgets of these governments, sir, not only have they been an announcement government rather than an action or implementation government, but they keep promising things and moving the goalposts, and now they moved it for another 25 years.
Thank you.
So I will conclude, sir, that a talent for developing flashy slogans is not enough, that in fact, today, instead of Amrut Kal over the next 25 years, today, sir, our people are facing Andhkal, and for this, it's extremely important that we must find a solution. Things are dark and
Nishikant
bleak for our people, but the dawn
Nishikant bhai.
will come, and I must say,